Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining our BC Digital live stream. My name is Gen Lambert, and I'm the Chief Digital Officer for the province of BC. And our Digital BC live stream, if you haven't been here before, is where we have conversations with thought leaders and experts from around the world, as well as right here at home. And it's a place for us to learn from those experts, ask them questions that we've always wanted to ask them, and to get inspired as well. So I'm grateful to be joining you today from the traditional and unceded territory of the Lekwungen and Wasanich peoples, whose historical relationships with the land continues to this day. This session is being recorded and will be posted online after the session. And you can turn on your live captions at the right-hand side of your screen next to the Q&A button there at the top. And as we're talking about Q&A, please do submit questions and upvote those from others that you like. And we'll get to as many of them today as we can, and then follow up afterwards. So to get us started today, I'm really excited to be introducing Richard Pope, who is joining us from the UK in a different time zone. So thank you so much, Richard, for coming at this point in the evening for you. A number of us in BC have been following Richard's writings for some time, and Richard was a founding member of the team of the UK Government Digital Service and the first product manager for gov.uk, the site. And Richard created many initial design concepts for both gov.uk as well as the digital account for universal credit, which is the UK's social security service. He was a senior fellow at Harvard in 2018-19, lecturing on government as a platform, which is a concept that we're all interested in as well. And his new book, Platformland, is an anatomy of next generation public services has really become a new touchstone for many of us in digital government, especially those of us that are thinking about and looking at how we can move forward on connected services, connecting services together for people to deliver better experiences. So welcome to the Digital BC live stream, Richard. We are very, very happy to have you with us today. So I've read the book, as you know, I've highlighted many paragraphs. I don't think those would show up very well on screen, the highlights, but they're all throughout, as well as some dog ears. So it's a very timely read for us right now as we're looking to ramp up our focus on connected services, and I definitely recommend it to anybody working in this space. As we get to that, Richard, could you tell us a little bit more about you and what inspired you to write your very useful book?
Thanks, Jen, and thanks for the invitation. I'm honoured to come speak to you all today, and good morning to everyone. As the thorough introduction, so I'm trying to think how to add to that. Maybe I'll speak a bit about the book and where that came from. So my background's in civic technology originally. I worked in startups a long time ago, but in civic technology. And when I got asked to write a book, that I really wanted to kind of bring some of that to the fore a bit. There's a lot of books out there about digital transformation. There's a lot of design books out there. I wanted to try and bring together the thing that got me excited when I was originally involved in civic technology, which is sort of bringing together technology and design and politics and democracy and accountability and trying to bring those things together in one place so we can get excited about those things again. I think it's quite easy to get dragged into a world of just thinking about the organizational change, financial saving, which are all very important things, or designing things kind of in the abstract. And I wanted to try and bring those things together a little bit. So that was the kind of origins of the book.
Mm-hmm. That's really impactful for me today. We had a meeting earlier today where we started with kind of a more abstract conversation about infrastructure and technology, and really through that conversation we're really brought back down to outcomes and the outcomes for people and how we work together on that. So yeah, that's a daily kind of reminder is really helpful to have that in your book, on my nightstand as well. So I'll start with a few questions from me, and then we'll get to questions from the audience. I'm sure there's some already coming through here today. We'll just start with kind of bringing it back to BC context. One of our primary missions in our digital plan that was released in 2023 is to deliver more connected services. And one of the things we mean by that is helping people more easily get the services that they need without having to understand the complexity of government, what parts of government will provide which services, just being able to access those services easily. And you cover that concept pretty extensively in your book. Could you tell us a little bit more about what connected services means to you and maybe share one of the examples that you describe in the book?
Yeah, sure. So actually, it's three things. I mean, something to say. There's almost like a philosophical argument, which is I would summarize as it's designing things that go with the grain of people's lives rather than against it. When it comes to the delivery of services, the actual design of services, the second part of it is I think it's about joining. There's no one way of joining services together. So we've got this kind of idea of life event services. There's quite a few of these in the book. I'm sure many of you will be familiar with. Governments sort of created services around life events like having a child or moving house, for example. We've also got, so there's some of those. There's also this idea of more what I've been calling composite services, so things that are much more loosely joined together by credentials, joined together by APIs, handoffs between one service and another. There's a really, and there's lots of examples of that came up through COVID, actually. So we saw here in the UK services that were no longer just a service that had been designed by a team. It was a local government service linking together with the health service, linking together with central government, and those services being created very quickly, but also it kind of worked. You could move between one domain and another, and it still worked. They also, for me, joined up services is about breaking the monopoly of delivery. If I can say what I mean by that, we've come from a world where digital services tended to be one of them. There was a service, and you went to it, and there was one organization that ran it. Digital APIs, data standards allow us to break that, and actually we can have a service that you can access in many different places. So to give you an example again here from the UK, our health service has got an app. You can get your prescriptions in that app. You can also, if you've downloaded an app from a high street pharmacist, you can also see those same prescriptions in there. So you can access the same information, you can achieve the same outcome in two different places. So digital lets us do that. So the old idea of things being public or private, centrally provided or locally provided starts to break down a bit in digital world. I think there's also something to say about government though as well. It's actually about government working in a more networked way as well. So it's kind of government of the digital age. It's the public sector working more as a network, less of a hierarchy.
Mm-hmm. So kind of that part of Conway's law where the service tends to look like the organization, and the more our organization can work together more collaboratively, then that's it becomes apparent to the people trying to get the services as well. I think one of the things that you just said now around sort of different levels of government and being able to move between one and the other in a way that seems like it's easier and maybe on purpose, that's possible. Is that something that you would see as a major challenge in developing connected services, or have you seen that be a challenge, or is that something that you think is, if we think about it in the right way and make those APIs and data standards available, it becomes a bit easier?
I think it becomes easier, and I think it's an opportunity. But we can't lose sight of the fact, and I'll say this later in the book, that technology creates new power dynamics as well. And actually, there is a world in which you centralize, and central governments, federal governments end up doing more. And then what does that do to devolution of power and there are some interesting lessons there from India, which has obviously invested a lot in digital public infrastructure, where they've done some really interesting things like creating new organizations that are part owned by the state governments and the central government. It's kind of interesting, and the private sector. So like their sales tax system is the technology that runs that is a kind of co-ownership model. But there are also examples from Aadhaar, the digital identity system, which is a centralized system that's been used to cleanse, in inverted commas, the voter record in states, but the ownership, responsibility, the mandate for running those things still remains local. So like who's actually calling the shots there? Like digital starts to do some slightly funny things to how power is distributed in society, and we need effective civil society organizations who can and politicians who really understand those dynamics and hopefully use them for good rather than ill, to kind of help us navigate that.
Hmm. Yeah, I find it really interesting to think about kind of the feedback loop between policy, legislation and implementation, and how it often has, at least historically, started with legislation, then policy, then implementation, and sometimes there's an interpretation in the middle there that makes it a bit different than maybe intended. Um, but then how are we learning from the implementation and the interpretation to feed that back into the cycle? So I think that's one of the examples of that is once we have the implementation, can that feed back into that sort of what is needed on the legislation and policy and governance side as well? We've gotten some good questions coming in right away, so maybe jump to those or meld them with some of my questions. So my next question was going to be looking back on your time working on universal credit. What did you learn about what makes a successful connected services, and what are some pitfalls that you've seen teams encounter when trying to create them? And there's some questions coming in about how often the UK consults with the public on services that are important to them. So maybe those are kind of related questions.
Yeah, I'll try and cover both those. I mean, I think so the backstory for people who don't know, universal credit was about how many years ago it was now? It was 2013, 2012, 2013. New government came in wanting to rationalise the welfare system. It was very much a big policy was written in many documents this thick, and the standard approach to procurement was taken, whereby literally it was kind of chopped up and given to 4 or 5 organisations. Lots of money was spent, nothing delivered. The government digital service, which had been created a few years previously, was asked to kind of help fix that and work with DWP, which is the welfare agency, to fix that. So a lot had already been decided up front, right? And it was by policy design, an effort to bring things together and to rationalise things. So some of that work had already done. So is that joined up services? Kind of, I guess there's less things than before, but it wasn't really about joining what was there. There were definitely some lessons from it though, which I think are relevant. So I think when we came into work on it, the organisation was still very much thinking that Cornway's Law kind of way internally. So there was not a single joined up service. There was a bit over here for doing payments and a bit over here for doing helping people find work, and a bit over here for onboarding. So one of the first things we did was just try and create a simple, try and bring those together in a user interface. And a bit of advice I would give any designers out there, sometimes, even though it feels counterintuitive, is if you've got a really knotty policy problem, try putting all the things on one page, like on one screen, and see if you can kind of make it make sense. Because it's kind of what we did was like, okay, we've got all these things, we'll put them on one page and see if we can make a coherent service. And we kind of just managed to do that, I think. So was that joining up though? I don't know. It was definitely about simplifying and abstracting away a lot of complexity. The main lessons for me were actually around what it's like to design a service like that, where you've got a couple of things. You've got lots of data being used to calculate people's payments, and how do you make that make sense to people? And you've also got you could call it an imbalance of power, but or competing incentives between the state and the public. So a lot of the standard user-centered design approaches to design things kind of start to break down a little bit. And we were having to design things that made it really tried to make it transparent to people what was happening, what had happened. To try and talk to the second part of that around feedback loops. One of the takeaways for me, like many years removed from having working on that, is that there's not a lot of transparency around how something like that, how it works. And another thing that digital does to public services is it can obfuscate how they work. Digital systems that change all the time, data-driven systems that are different for one person and another, are really complicated to understand. So when an organization, civil society organization, wants to understand how that works so they can complete the feedback loop, help make it better, it's really hard for them to do. So we've had examples here of charities having to create mock-ups of how the system works to try and critique it. And actually, we need it's showed that we need much more transparency much more on the public record about how digital services work and how they're changing, not just for the good of transparency, but so that we can start to develop those feedback loops. And I know there's loads of really great research that goes on in the team who run that service, but it's not necessarily transparent to the outside world.
Hmm. Yeah, I've really found service blueprints help us, like as we're developing a service, to create the service blueprint at the same time, help us to have sort of a record of like how does this actually work? It's kind of complicated to look at, but it really helps, especially as you have so much turnover and folks getting promoted to different places in government, helps to have that record of how a service works, and hopefully as we learn more from working with the public and having feedback on it, then those can be updated as well. A really good question coming in around the sort of interplay of technologists and other folks, and how that can help move a connected service forward. So the question is, what opportunity do you see for non-IMIT roles like policy analysts, executives, and subject matter experts in a shift towards connected services, when sometimes it can be framed as just a technology initiative?
Yeah. So one of the lessons from the Universal Credit Project was about bringing policy people closer to delivery. I actually think there's a more generalizable rule there, or generalizable point there, which is we've got these very tight delivery loops in digital. Things are happening and changing all the time. We need to bring other professionals into that loop somehow. So that's policy people definitely, because they're helping set the policy and hopefully learning from what's being delivered. But it's also like rule of law professionals, like lawyers who really care about whether people understand how services work and whether people are getting their rights or not. Okay, like if they're outside that loop and they're seeing things and they're commenting on it every 2 years and writing papers and critiquing it that way, it doesn't feed in. So I've already mentioned civil society organisations. You see it with security people working on projects. You see it with if you in the health space, clinicians. Like, how do you bring lots of like varied professionals into that kind of delivery loop? Is an ongoing question, I think, but it gets to the root of it, hopefully.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think there's also some questions around how do you do that in a way that manages engagement fatigue as well? Like how do you make it so that those folks want to participate in the process and keep it sort of right sized for that? That's a balance that it can be hard to achieve, but the intentions there. Any tips on that?
I mean, I think the lesson is that it works when people are on the team and part of the team. It works less well when it's kind of drive-by advice. And I know that's hard, and you don't want teams to get huge, but I think you need people on teams.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Absolutely. You mentioned data and the importance of data to the universal credit service, and it's important to so many services. I mean, it's really the foundation for so many of them. And somebody has been keeping tabs on what's happening in the UK and noticed that the UK Data Register program seems to have been retired in 2021. Do you have any visibility into that, or what the challenges were that might have led to that program being retired?
It's not just that one. I think I was thinking the other day how many data initiatives we've had in central government in the UK. We basically have one every 2 years. And I know like there's lots to hold up that's good about UK digital and data, but not UK digital, but actually our data historically has been a gap. So the register program was a really good initiative to try and create some canonical data registers of the sort that I know you've got in BC. There was a couple of years later, there was another project that was trying to look at federated data. We've currently got an initiative that's come out of the new incoming government, which is a national data library, which is currently filling that gap. I think I wouldn't critique any one of those individual initiatives. What I would say is that data infrastructure takes time, and the lead times are much longer than public-facing services. So you look at Estonia, which obviously everyone points out as the definitive example, and how it's so easy because it was greenfield. X-Road didn't. Someone did a study on this. X-Road didn't get uptake until it had something like 50 data sources connected to it, and then suddenly you get network effects, and it's useful. It just takes a lot longer. So I think the reason the UK has not really cracked it is because, not the only reason, it's partly the weights of departments relative to each other, but the reason it hasn't cracked it is it's not really invested in it for the long term. Hopefully this current incarnation will do that, but we might be here in another 2 years with something different, with a different label.
I think it's an interesting challenge that we've thought about a lot in BC is how much you sort of do things that are persistent and that maybe aren't as flashy and talked about. So if you can keep that momentum going throughout successive areas of priority, like if you can make sure that something stays priority no matter what the political priorities of the day are. Some things need that more foundational long-term investment, and often that's sort of the a balance between how much sort of shine you want on it and how much longevity you want on it, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah, so we've got some good questions coming in around governance. What do you think the governance models are that help support public platforms best, and some pitfalls that we might want to think about avoiding when we're thinking about governance around connected services?
Specifically around platforms, I mean, I think the lesson from around the world actually has been that the platforms that are successful are ones that are designed for self-service by teams, so ones that actually meet the needs of teams delivering services. They need to be designed with that in mind, and with that comes some of the governance. Because if you understand your users, if you've got a connection with them, you've got the feedback loops with them, that's some of your governance. I think there's also some interesting lessons from the digital public goods, digital public infrastructure world, where you've got some projects with some quite sizable investment and sizable teams operating, like building public infrastructure, but operating as mature open source projects. So their code is available, their backlogs are available. They do monthly showcases and town halls where people can come and ask questions. They maybe publish their security assessments. It's like that for me is governance as well. So it's partly about clear proposition. It's partly about these things operating, taking the best lessons of open source software and applying them to government services and government infrastructure.
Another sort of maybe a governance related question that has come in is around this government has specifically made some commitments to co-manage lands and waters with First Nations. And that can be definitely interpreted as a commitment to co-design and collaboratively delivering associated services. Do you sense that the platform approaches that you describe in your book to government helps to serve those commitments? And have you seen any examples of that, or how do you think about that topic?
Specific examples, no. One of the things that I do talk about in the book, though, is the idea of co-production. So co-production it's not about co-design of a service, but co-production of outcomes, and that's based on the work of Eleanor Ostrom, who did actually a lot of her work was around the co-ownership of natural resources and watersheds and forestry and the like. So I think there's some learnings from there, and they're broadly like, how do you design services so that you don't see it as a thing that's done to people, but you're co-producing an outcome together. So some of the most famous example that she gives is police forces and crime. So like if you put all of your police officers in cars and have them driving around and never talk to anybody, there's no opportunity for people to talk to them and tell them about what's going on, and you're losing the opportunity to co-produce public safety. Like so how do you design services that enable people to have conversations, have feedback, like take part in feedback loops? I think is like a generalizable point. Like the specific examples you do, I don't have any direct parallels to those, I'm afraid.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point that you make in your book. And I think that was kind of the biggest light bulb moment for me in reading your book is this sort of the co-production of connection as well, is that we as government don't need to think of all of the ways that services need to be connected together. If we design services in a way that the people who want the services or who could benefit from the services are the ones connecting them together, but it's easy for them to do that, that is much more scalable and flexible and responsive to the way that there's diversity in the people that need services, than if we try to think of all the permutations or make really tight bundles of services. So I wonder if you could speak a little bit more to that and sort of some of the maybe some um, contrasting examples of like a bundling that didn't work because it was too tight, or and sort of the opposite.
Um, so I think the thing that I think is most interesting in this idea of like, people joining services together in a way that works for them is around credentials. And digital credentials tend to get described as like from the point of view of privacy and data minimization uh, and that's all good, right? Like, and that's it's not to take that away. That is often the case. But I think they're more interesting from the point of view of creating demand pressure on government. So if you give people the right to prove that they, so a good example here is free school meals. So if you're a family in certain circumstances, your children get free school meals, and that's used as a gateway a gateway benefit. Essentially, if you get that, you get a bunch of other things. And the way people prove it is through bits of paper that they have to kind of print out, or emails have to print out to try and prove it. Like we don't give people a digital proof that they can then provide to another service and go, you must take this because I've been given it by another part of government. So I think there's a potential to create demand pressure for people to join things up in ways that work for them. I think that's really interesting. So one example where centralized design didn't work, and there's a bit of mea culpa in this because I was involved in the design of it, is around gov.uk, which is our central government's website. In designing that, we intentionally abstracted away something of how government works. We tried to make it so that people wouldn't have to understand the structure of government to get things done. And that's right, we're applying good user-centered design principles. So like help people get to a task they need to do as quickly as possible. Somewhere in the evolution of that, it kind of ended up being that we should actually hide how government worked, I think. So there's an example from as that approach kind of rolled out across government and got absorbed within the way government delivers services. I think something got lost, and as an example, I'll give you which I think summarizes it. So there was an effort to digitize some of the court system and some court services, and that ended up being branded as government, as central government. And we have this weird situation where people will be going to one web page to get a service, and if that service didn't work for them, they went to another web page that looked exactly the same, dealing with the same organization, to make a complaint about it. And it doesn't quite feel right. There's something in designing an understanding of how the public sector and how government works. I think there's a responsibility on designers not to just make things simple, but to help people understand how their government, how their democracy works, and something of how separation of powers work, and how and where things are different. And yeah, that was almost like an over extension, I think, of gov.uk. That did get rectified and it got rebranded and it was more clearly denoted as being the court system. But I think there's other examples of like that in the public sector, and the design approach that lots of brilliant things happened in the last 10, 15 years around bringing good quality user-centered design into the public sector. It's really, really good. But for me, that feels like it's necessary but not sufficient. We've got to expand out a bit and really think about what does it mean to design a public service that people have the right to understand how it works, and they have the right to change how it works, and there are accountability mechanisms behind it in a way there are not for an iPhone or a TV. where you're just kind of buying the thing.
Yeah, we have to think about things a bit differently than if we're just selling a product, that people have the option to buy or not buy, for sure. So some added responsibility on our designers and our policymakers, as well as our digital folks that are helping to implement all of that. It sounds like we're getting a lot of questions about how to tackle connected services. And I think that's kind of related to what you just described, is like sometimes we don't make the right decisions, and we have to update them later. Um, and that can be a bit daunting, is like, how do we start this if we're not sure exactly what to do?
Yeah.
So the question is, it's hard not to spend too much time designing the big picture first in ways that will just take way too long. What's your advice for getting to the thin slice of something so complex, or so potentially complex, like a connected service?
So maybe I'll say in a minute some of the things that I think work for connected services, and then but before, something about getting started. Again, not to critique it too hard, but some of the practices that's grown up in the last decade or so around delivering digital services, I think is this idea of like, you do a discovery and then you create some prototypes and then you slowly you build a thing, and that's really good for some situations. It's really good when you're like, I'm not really sure where we're what we're building here, and there's nothing there at the moment. It's a relatively greenfield thing, and if the thing that you're designing is primarily a user interface problem, it's the right thing to do. There are other classes of the problem where either there's something there at the moment, you've got to work out how to change it, or you're only really going to learn, you're only going to test your riskiest assumptions by getting something in front of real users. And you won't know how people really react until it is like their benefit they're applying for, their healthcare appointment they're booking. So like understanding when you've got one of those classes of problems versus the other one is an important thing, I think. My suspicion is there are more things that need real people and need real feedback loops. And the answer there is not necessarily about designing the right thing. It's about thinking about where you can start, so you can start to explore and iterate from there.
So taking
and
like
that can be, sorry.
No, I was just gonna say, do you mean like taking a feasibility approach? Like where is it possible to start?
No, it's more like getting some real users is sometimes half the
Okay.
battle. So going back to universal credit, for example, that was something that launched in originally it was planned to be a big bang, like everyone pretty much a good chunk of the population was going to get this thing in one go. After that was reset, the way it launched was in one postcode district, not too far from where I am here. The tap got turned on for a couple of hours, and if people applied and they typed in that postcode, they came in, and there were, I can't remember how many people there were, but it was like 12 or something for the sake of argument. A really, really small, but they were real users, and there was enough of a digital system there for them to be able to sign up and get started. But there were loads of manual processes behind the scenes. But once you've got some real people, you can start to understand, like, okay, what things do we need to automate, really? Because otherwise we're kind of just guessing. So actually having real users, a bit like a startup would do, but in a obviously very different setting in government, you've got some real users, you can start to understand their behavior and like use that to guide your prioritization. Because actually the thing you thought you needed to automate, actually turned out you didn't, and there's something else you've got to do instead. So I would encourage people, like in many things, like getting to a beta and alpha a bit more quickly, I think is often the right thing to do.
That makes sense. And can help us save time to get to the end, right? If we're not spending a bunch of time automating things that don't need to be automated.
Yeah, and you risk that you hopefully get around that same way. Sometimes if you give a delivery team a really big problem, especially these like life event type things, like what should we do for new parents or prison leavers or something like that, you can just spend like a long time thinking, like an ever expanding service design effort. And actually the thing to do sometimes is to just start somewhere. Some more practical things around joining up services for teams. I've already mentioned working in the open, like a mature open source project. I think APIs, designing APIs, publishing those, and making that a cost of doing business, I think is really important. You don't know who might use them, so just like making that how we deliver services, I think, is important. I think for leaders, it's about giving teams permission to think about the ecosystem they fit in and the burdens they might be creating beyond what they're doing at the moment. So there's lots of examples of really well-designed digital services, and then there's the handoff between them and somewhere else. It's just like, well, you have to print out this PDF, because they don't really have permission to think beyond that. And then I know we haven't really talked about proactive services that much, but I think there's something for policymakers, leaders and policymakers to understand around it. You don't quite know how these systems are going to respond. If you start joining things up and you start being a bit more proactive and saying, you could apply for this, you could apply for this, some of that's going to cost more money. Some of it will save money. But to date, we've been relying on badly joined up, badly designed systems to save money. And actually, those things should be in the domain of policymaking. It's absolutely fine for politicians to say, we're going to make this thing harder or this thing easier. Absolutely. What we shouldn't be doing is relying on like hiding behind slightly broken systems to enforce that kind of thing. So that requires a little bit of boldness from politicians and policymakers to go, actually, yeah, we're gonna make this thing a bit more proactive, a bit more joined up, and we're going to accept some risk that we don't know how it will change people's behavior, because it probably will do a little bit.
Yeah, and I would say it's not generally intentional that folks are hiding behind broken systems. It's just that like they may not even know that the reason for the low uptake is because things are hard to get into.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's rarely malicious, but it's that.
Yeah.
But it's kind of hard to go from there. Like, oh God, we know if we change this, actually, it may well be, it's.
Yeah. For sure.
No, I think it's very rarely malicious.
Yeah. So maybe a related question. We've got a question coming in around what could be done to encourage a mindset shift amongst the public leaders who aren't exposed to design, to recognize the need for a user-centered and service design-led approach?
I mean, the thing I'm sure you've heard from many other people is getting them to see the work. It's obviously again like bringing them in to see it. That does work. The thing I'd like to see more is actually politicians understanding the affordances of technology a bit more and placing. It's still really easy for senior people, senior politicians, and for politicians to almost. It's a good way of phrasing this. I think we treat digital and technology as this kind of other thing over here. So the real work of policy is going on over here, and I don't think we have a good understanding a lot of the time around the risks and opportunities of technology. What can we use it for, and where? Like, so I gave the example of like the ability of technology to centralize, for example. That's something I really want politicians to understand as a trade-off. I don't think we're there at the moment. So there's just a greater education around what you can and can't do with digital. Sorry, it feels like a bit of a vague answer, but.
Yeah, and I think, as you say, getting to alpha and beta faster and being able to show the work and show the difference, really, when you have something tangible, it does tend to help folks understand what the benefit is and what you learned in the process and what you learned from people who are ultimately, the folks that folks are accountable to, so that they care about that.
Yeah, I think I'm gonna, if it's the same there, but it certainly is here, that if you actually hear from politicians, they're generally they want things to deliver, they want to see things, and the sooner you can show things that work and be honest about what's not working, generally it lands quite well.
Yeah, especially if you've already changed it to support the feedback that you got. Maybe a question related to sort of the positives and benefits and the risks associated with technology. We've got a question here that got a lot of upvotes about software as a service and the sort of contractual terms and costs of software as a service. And once you kind of sign up for it, those terms can change as you go. And how should we manage that? How can we work with those platforms, understanding that that's something that can happen?
Yeah, Probably say two things on that that hopefully will resonate. And the first one is government as a buyer. Like government has got a lot of power as a buyer and it can dictate them to some extent. UK government here just published something called the Blueprint for Digital Government, and there's some things in there around government acting as the public sector as a whole acting as a buyer and the power that gives it. The other thing I think, which is the other thing to say, which is something that teams can do who are delivering things, is one of the affordances of technology, of digital technology, is we can abstract things quite easily. So we can put wrappers around things, and we can actually deal with multiple different providers through a standard interface. So there's a nice example of that from gov.uk Notify here in the UK. When that was originally set up, so that's a service for sending, sorry, it's a platform for sending text messages and letters and emails. It was originally set up with two competing text message providers. So there was some inbuilt resilience, but also it meant that government's not going to be trapped by a single provider. So that as a model is quite nice actually, where you've got and you see it in hosting and compute as well, where governments will set up systems so they can deploy to Amazon or Google or Microsoft, and it kind of doesn't matter from the point of view of the service which one they're using.
Mm-hmm. We are getting a bit close to the end of the time here, so I'll ask maybe one more question. We'll see how long that goes, and then we may have time for one more question after that. So interesting question about sort of making source code available. So in addition to portability, making it available for others to use. BC actually has the most open source repos of any jurisdiction. We just surpassed the UK just recently. So there's a question around whether we should be doing this. Should government technology services be developed in a source available manner? Should code be publicly available online for public review by citizens, journalists, and security researchers?
Yes, absolutely. It should do, because it's part of the way that the rest of society understands how things work. So I think it's less about someone taking the open source code for a tax system and going, I'm going to set up my own tax system. People, it's not quite the same as other open source software in that respect, but for the scrutability of it, it's really important. So if you want effective civil society scrutiny over software, then the code needs to be open. But also things like the database schemas, the release logs, security incidents when they've been written up and addressed. So those things need to be public domain, I think. I co-wrote the UK service standard here, and we put in that line that said code should be open source, but I can tell you most of it doesn't get open sourced overhead. There's always people, it's one of the less well enforced points over here, unfortunately. So I'm not surprised you've taken this. I would actually go beyond that though. I think it's not just enough to publish. I think governments are beginning to take part in open source projects. And I know BC is that, like, I think, if I'm correct in saying, has directly employed people to work on open source software that is critical to the delivery of your services, and that feels like a brilliant model. You're seeing countries beginning to collaborate on open source software, putting developers from different governments working on the same bit of infrastructure. So X-Road, I mentioned earlier, was obviously an Estonian initiative, but the organisation that runs that now has got representatives from many countries. Mm-hmm. So actually seeing governments contributing to and taking part in open source, I think is the future, mm-hmm, rather than just publishing, but publishing is critical.
Mm-hmm. That's great. Yes, I think that we contribute a lot to especially the digital credential globally, and benefit from other people contributing as well. So we are near, we've got only 1 minute left. I will say that there have been some great questions coming in around sort of the importance of consent and folks consenting for data to be shared across services when that is something that's necessary for a connected service. So I would definitely agree with that question and point there. And we've got some good questions about AI that came in that we didn't get to. So I know that you indicated you were open to helping us answer any remaining questions on a blog in the future. So that we'll definitely look forward to that, and it'll be very special guest blog for us. So thank you so much for joining us today. We're really privileged to have you with us. And I think as we learn from these types of discussions, we see that, delivering great services depends on the collaboration and the learning from others and building connections. And thanks so much for being here and building connections with us today. And to our audience, which are a very large audience that we've got today, asking such great questions for making those connections as well. So to the audience, if you missed part of this discussion today or want to share it, there will be a recording available on YouTube, and please do take a moment to fill out our survey to help us make these as valuable as possible going forward. And thanks again, Richard, for joining us. It was wonderful.
Thank you.